From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do sign up at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your listening. This week, that was the year that was. In a special holiday episode of this podcast, I'm going to take a look back at 2024. The highs, the lows, the ebbs, the flows, the good, the bad, the happy, the sad. At home, abroad, the perfect, the flawed. Okay, I've run out of embarrassingly cringe-making rhymes, so let's get straight into this extraordinary year. It was a banner year in all kinds of respects, politically, economically, internationally and geopolitically, culturally too. And I can't think of a better person to reflect on this whole year than one of our most prominent journalists and commentators, one that I most admire, John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary magazine, as you know, and not only the editor of that great magazine, but host of the magazine's podcast, a prolific writer, critic, and journalist over quite a long career. John, thanks very much indeed for joining this special episode of Free Expression.
Pleasure, Gerry. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I know it is that time of year when one podcaster talks to another podcaster about things that they've talked about on their podcast for the last 12 months. So forgive me, but that's exactly what I propose to do. Let me start, John, because you're one of the most thoughtful, as well as if you don't mind me saying so, one of the most seasoned political observers around. You and I have been around about this.
Are you alluding to my age? Is this just a comfortable way for you to point out that I am but a few short years from collecting Social Security? Because that is true.
Well, you and I are almost exactly the same age, I fear. So if you are, then I'm older and longer in the tooth. But the reason I put it like that is that this has been another extraordinary year, right? We've seen astonishing things in politics. We've seen, an incumbent president pull out of his re-election campaign. We've seen assassination attempts on a presidential candidate. We've seen former president and presidential candidate convicted on, I think you and I both agree, largely sort of bogus charges in a courtroom, but nonetheless convicted. And we've seen this war in the Middle East, which I also want to talk about, and the extraordinary progress that Israel has made there. And I look at this, and, again, I've been around a long time, and I sometimes wonder, it does seem as though history is sort of accelerating at times. The famous Lenin phrase about, decades happening in a week and all this kind of stuff. But I wonder, do you think this sense that we have as journalists, that we are so close to events and we have this kind of recency bias, that we see all of these extraordinary things, are things actually happening at a more dramatic pace than they have at any point in our lifetime? Or is it somehow an illusion caused by social media and technology and everything else? What's your sense of the pace of history and the way it seems to be moving? And again, whether it's real or whether it's illusory.
I feel like this is where I came in, alluding to my age. When I think about what this year is like, it strikes me that there are many analogs in this year, and worrisomely, possibly in the upcoming years, to the time when I was 6, 7, 8 years old in the late 1960s. You allude to the fact that a president bows out of a race, obviously Biden doing it in a particularly dramatic and peculiar way pretty late in the game. But of course, in 1968, in February of 1968, Lyndon Johnson, who had just 3 years earlier won a colossal landslide election. A landslide election in which he not only secured 61% of the vote or 62% of the vote, but he had 69 Democrats in the Senate to pass his legislation at will. And because the war in Vietnam had taken a particularly bloody turn and there was social unrest in the streets of the cities, does poorly in the state of New Hampshire, relatively speaking, and pulls out of the presidential race, throws the Democratic Party into chaos. There is a 6-month period in which he's out, Gene McCarthy is in, then Robert F. Kennedy Sr. comes into the race. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in March of 68. RFK is assassinated in June of 1968. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, ends up as the presidential candidate. And Richard Nixon, the Republican, ends up winning the presidency in 68. Now, none of this is precisely analogous to 2024, but it's not analogous, right? I mean, the thing is that America in 1968 was in a genuine domestic and foreign policy crisis. There were race riots, civil rights fights, gigantic protests against the Vietnam War, 500,000 men at arms in Southeast Asia, and a real sense of social degradation, social revolution, hippies, drugs, crime. And America is a much more stable place now than it was then. But it doesn't feel as stable, right? It doesn't feel stable at all. And the West in general doesn't feel stable either. I was just saying on my podcast this morning that if you look around, Trump wins, right? The German government has collapsed. The French president had to replace essentially his government, the prime minister and the government that lives under him. Keir Starmer in Britain, having won 400 plus seats in the parliament, is now at 26% in the polls. Justin Trudeau might be falling in Canada, and there was this bizarre effort to stage a coup in South Korea. And the war is ongoing in Ukraine, and of course, there is a kind of complete chessboard reset going on in the Middle East. So very dramatic things are happening, but they're not, to me, entirely unfamiliar in the course of my lifetime, though my memory of the days that I'm alluding to is, colored by what was on Saturday morning cartoon TV more than it is by whatever was going on in the race riots in Washington after Martin Luther King's assassination.
You may have been a child, but you were obviously a precocious child as you were digesting all of these world historical events. The 68 analogy is a good starting point because so many people made that point this week. There are so many similarities, whether, thank God, nothing on the same scale, but episodes of political violence. We had Democratic Party to some extent internally weakened by a war overseas, again, not on the same scale. And so many of these respects, actually, 2024 looks like a kind of a pale imitation, a sort of an echo of 68 rather than a repetition. One of the things, of course, that we learned about 68, whether we knew it at the time or not, but we certainly learned subsequently, was that it was a realignment year. It was a year, you just said, Lyndon Johnson had been elected just 4 years early with this astonishing majority. Then in comes Nixon, wins relatively narrowly, thanks in part to George Wallace in the South, wins relatively narrowly, but then is able to consolidate that 4 years later and realign politics, change the whole nature of sort of the basis of party support, particularly through Republicans and all of that. Do you see echoes of that in 2024, that maybe Trump's victory is indeed a realigning moment?
Completely. I mean, so the Nixon story would be that with the absence of, without Watergate, which was a very anomalous event, even with Watergate, Jimmy Carter only wins the presidency by a point in 1976 and then is mowed down basically in 1980 by Ronald Reagan, meaning that from 1968 to 1992, there was one Democratic president and there were 6 elections in which Republicans were elected, right? Nixon, 68, 72, Reagan, 82, 84, Bush, 88. So I don't know whether it's 5 or 6. Anyway, and Carter kind of getting a lucky shot to win in 76. And one thing that you can say is analogous, if you're thinking that maybe this is a realigning election, is that there was a sense in the United States that the country was spinning out of control and that the party in power, the Democratic Party, did not have any answers to explain why crime was high, why inflation was rising, why prices were rising, why everything felt unsafe, and did not seem to have an explanation for its foreign policy behavior in Southeast Asia. Somehow it had sort of become a kind of entropic mess. And what we can see in 2024 is the border standing in for crime, inflation not standing in for anything but inflation, a sense that the country is on the wrong track, and a sense that in the persons of Joe Biden and then Kamala Harris, there was absolutely no narrative laid out to explain to the American people why they should stick with this team in any way, shape, or form. So much so that they defaulted to this guy they had rejected 4 years earlier in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and who had been indicted on 91 different counts, had been found liable in a courtroom, had his company taken away by the New York State Attorney General, had had 31 felony convictions, had had all these indictments against him, and nonetheless continues his domination of his own party. And then simply, I wouldn't say walked into the presidency. It was a relatively close election. But if we had had this conversation 2 years ago today, after the 2022 midterms, I think my saying to you, well, what's going to happen is that Trump will be reelected president, be running a kind of quite brilliant transition period with 53 Republican senators. You would have said, well, I think you're a little mad. I mean, don't you think DeSantis is going to beat him? I mean, look how badly Republicans did in the midterms in 2022, and Trump's got all this baggage and people didn't like him in 2020. So in that sense, history's speeding up because all of the things that led to Trump's being thrown out in 2020 somehow have faded, and the new realities have taken their place. And he is now, stands astride the narrow world like a colossus as the leader, as the unambiguous, almost sitting president, right? As Biden kind of like wanders off back to Delaware, doesn't say much of anything, doesn't have anything much to say about what's going on in the Middle East, what's going on in South Korea, what's going on in Ukraine, what's going on in the United States with the politics of the United States. He's checked out either medically, mentally, or emotionally. And Trump is inviting people to his inauguration. He's meeting with every major business leader in the United States. They're all giving him money for his inauguration. He's getting all these phone calls and briefings from foreign leaders on what's going on in the middle of the crises that they're facing. It's a pretty astounding turn of events.
If 2024 is a realigning year, realigning election, what are the terms of the realignment? Again, you've gone into already some of the reasons that Trump won, dissatisfaction with the economy, a kind of wider dissatisfaction with, if you like, our sort of, the political elites that we've seen here. And, Trump is now clearly on immigration, on inflation, on the economy, on a kind of America first foreign policy, is going to do all of those things that we kind of expect him, that are consistent with things that he said. But are you of the view that this is a political shift in the sense that the Republican Party 2024 lays to rest the question of whether the Republican Party has been radically changed by Trump towards a more populist, hate that term, but let's use it, we all kind of know what it means, towards a more populist tilt? Or are you still of the view that, well, actually, maybe, I know there are still some people out there who think, that it's just Trump. It's a personalist political movement, and when he goes, it's gone? Or do you really think now we have a pretty radically different Republican Party from the one that we've just got used to, certainly since Ronald Reagan?
I think it's a radically different Republican Party, but whether or not it's a Trump party or it's morphing into a new thing is what we don't know. And a lot of that is going to depend on whether this is a successful 4 years or not a successful 4 years, by which I mean that if you think about the Republican Party from 2008 through 2016 with the two Obama terms and the candidates who arose in the Republican Party to challenge Obama, to speak to Obama, to come at Obama, it was a very, very well-behaved at the leadership level, well-behaved, well-groomed, responsible, sober group of people: Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell. These were not firebrands. They wanted to figure out how to govern respectably, to talk to the American people in a way that did not seem overly harsh, overly cruel, overly combative, and they were going to take issues seriously and win on the basis of that. And that's what Trump completely eviscerated and mowed down, right? This field of candidates in 2016, all of whom seemed like superstars, governors of states, former governors of states, young, dynamic senators, exciting personalities who really showed that they had something new to say. And then on comes this reality TV star in his 70s with this spray painted hair coming down an escalator and just being an insult comedian and showing a kind of ugliness and personal nastiness that we had never before even remotely experienced in American politics. And one of the virtues of that, political virtues, I mean, in the Machiavellian sense, not like virtues like a moral virtue, was that it punctured this Republican seriousness like a balloon. It turned out that it was all a balloon. It was all a fake. It wasn't real. It didn't represent the actual views of most people in the party, or it would have had it shown any ability to withstand or deal with or combat or stop Obama in his tracks, none of which it was able to do. And he came along and was the person who could say, Hillary Clinton is a crook. I'm going to take her down. We have to stop all this. Everything that's gone on in this country in both parties has been 20 years of foolishness and corruption. And he comes in and takes things over. Where it goes now between 2024 and 2028 or 2029 is entirely dependent on him showing success. Reagan realigned America between 1981 and 1985 because he showed unbelievable results. Huge economic recovery, huge defense, a recovery of America's sense of self, positive populist patriotism. The American mood shifted positively, and he was the beneficiary, as was the Republican Party. Reagan wins 49 states, changes American politics forever. It's not even until 2008 that a serious leading Democratic politician was willing to describe himself as a liberal. Took 24 years for the word liberal to lose its bad odor.
Yeah.
That's a pretty striking fact, right? So I think Trump has 4 years to show results. And what are those results? They are the cost of living has to be controlled or contained or made more livable for people. The world has to seem like it's steadier, more stable, fresher, and more able to cope with the future. And our adversaries have to feel like they are on the run. That could be China, either financially or if China wants to be adventurous in the South China Sea. It can be Iran, which I think is really now suddenly low-hanging fruit in terms of dealing with that stuff. It could be NATO in the sense that the world in which we have spent all this time with people saying things like foreign leaders are embarrassed by America. They don't want to deal with Trump. Like they think he's an idiot and it's embarrassing and he's embarrassing them and they're much more serious. You can't look at Olaf Scholz and Macron and Starmer and the leaders of Western Europe and say that they don't look like greater fools than Donald Trump, who is a political, not a mastermind, but obviously a man with far greater political skills than any of them has and a far greater sense of what his people want and where to go in the future than they have. And so if he shows the American people, if they feel better about America in 2028 than they feel today, and he has mapped a course in some fashion for the future, then yeah, it could be a real, even a larger realignment than 1984 because the Democratic Party has lost its ability even to describe what ordinary life is like.
Yeah.
Party starts talking about birthing persons and won't say what a woman is, and the candidate for the Supreme Court, the nominee, says, well, I'm not a biologist, I can't tell you what a woman is, and things like that. And that's the party that is going to be running against a more commonsensical party that says a man is a man, a woman is a woman, boys shouldn't play in girls' sports, don't be giving 8-year-olds puberty blocking medication, don't be performing irreversible surgeries on kids, you people are all crazy, and what's more, go patrol the border, because that's not a heavy lift if he can pull it off. And it's a heavy lift for Democrats to figure out what to say, given their surrender to this weird worldview that has so haunted people.
We're going to take a break there, but when we come back, I'll have more with John Podhoretz. Looking back at 2024, we're going to look in particular at the international picture, what we've seen, war in the Middle East especially. And we're going to also end by taking a look at the state of culture, in particular media. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary Magazine. We're taking a look back at the big events of 2024. So I wanted to talk about the Democrats and what they learned from 2024, if anything. Again, you've given the historical example of, how it took basically from 68 to 92 for the Democrats to sort of actually get back the political initiative. And they did that. It took a long time. They did it. The New Democrats, ultimately led by Bill Clinton and Al Gore, restoring the Democratic Party to the kind of common sense you're talking about. Because, again, in 68 and beyond, it was very much, again, the party of kind of, anti-American, sort of pro-criminal, all of those things that really just alienated it from people. But what do they do this time? It's really interesting. I'm in an interesting kind of email exchange with a good sort of friend of mine who's a big Democrat and, very much a kind of mainstream, might say, Democrat. And he's, his prescription is, well, the party needs to acknowledge that the border's real. We have to close the border and be sensible about that. Get rid of all this faculty lounge absurdity language in our politics. Take globalization more seriously and have more understanding and more concern for the disruption that it's caused to communities. Put America's national interest first. Stop sort of like constantly kind of looking like we care more about people in foreign countries than we care about America's own national interest. And I said to him, look, all sounds great, but, where are you going to fit in with the Republican Party there? What's the alternative? I get you have to embrace all of those things that you've, for some weird reason, abandoned for the last 10 years or so. And how do the Democrats, first of all, jettison all of that nonsense that they've taken on board in the last few years? And what's the lesson maybe from Bill Clinton? Then at the same time, offer a kind of plausible and attractive alternative to what Donald Trump and presumably J.D. Vance or whoever it is going to be offering.
It's all a question of whether Democratic voters and Democratic politicians think that they're wrong. In other words, they have a marketing problem. That everybody sort of understands. If you lose an election, you get 226 electoral votes and you needed 270, and the other guy gets 312. You have a marketing problem. If you end up with 47 senators instead of 51 senators, you have a marketing problem, and you got to solve the marketing problem. But if they don't actually believe that they're wrong about the things that they have said they believe over the last 10 or 12 years, that the border, that it's an act of human rights abuse to sort of close the border or to treat people at the border in the way that's clearly going to happen, including deportations and stuff like that. If they can't see their way clear to not believing that, if they can't wake up from the madness that has gripped them on the trans issue and other issues like that, because they believe that this is the great civil rights issue of our time, if they can't jettison the Green New Deal and their green energy approach because they believe that it is going to save the planet as opposed to destroy the American economy and create even more inflation, they're not going to change because this is what they believe. And it's not like nobody else believes it. I mean, they do. On the one hand, they lost the election, but, Kamala Harris did get 48% of the vote. George H.W. Bush got 38% of the vote in 1992. She wasn't blown out of the water. And there are a lot of people who subscribe to the American left liberal agenda, and they are the vanguard of the party. And if I were going to guess, I would guess that the vanguard of the party gets stronger, not weaker, with the defeat of the guy that they think they chose because he was the most moderate person in 2020, and he was supposed to lead them not only past Trump, but into a new respectable land, and he maybe didn't go far enough. And so your friend is very sensible. What he is describing does not describe what happens in American politics. Did the Republican Party, remember, the Republican Party, 2008, Obama blows them out of the water, and they nominate Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney picks Paul Ryan and all of this. And at the same time, while all that was going on, Obama is sort of charging ahead, and the party, inside the soul of the party, the thing was, if we don't take these guys out, they're going to destroy our country. They're going to destroy our moral fabric. And we're too nice. We're too nice, and we're being too accommodating, and we're being too pleasant. We veto stuff, and then Obama says he's going to use his pen and phone and do unconstitutional things to get what he wants. And we need to bring in this Bulvan, this bruiser, to come in and take out Hillary and the Democratic establishment, because we've tried being nice, and Bush was nice, and Romney's nice, and they're all nice. And as a result, the country is being taken over by these people that we hate. And I think it's much more likely that that is what the Democratic vanguard is going to think about Trump in 2025 and 2026, and about the Republicans in general, that this is an existential threat, and that they're going to double down on who they are. It took a long time for Bill Clinton to come around. If we're dating the Republican change either to 68 or to 80, remember Clinton's 12 years after Reagan, and he's 24 years after Nixon. So it's not like Democrats are like, oh boy, we really blew it here in 72 with McGovern. We better fix ourselves. Well, they kind of did. They chose this Southern weird evangelical Christian who said he had lust in his heart and said he would never lie to you, and then turned out that he was plenty able to lie to you and was himself no conservative. But it took a long time for the Democratic Party to find this path that it found. And the idea that the Democratic Party now is going to find it in 6 months or before the 2026 election just seems science fictional to me.
We talked obviously about this realigning election. We've talked about the significance of it, and no one can gainsay that. It's clearly a big and important election. The first popular vote win for a Republican in 20 years. The first popular vote win for a Republican from outside the White House since Ronald Reagan in 1980. So it's significant all those things. But is there a danger that we can be overstating all this too? One of the things that I've written quite a lot in the last 4 years, and I know you believe this too, because I've heard you say it and I've read you write it. Joe Biden won, by the way, the popular vote by quite a bit more than Donald Trump just won, but Joe Biden won in 2020 by 4 percentage points, 7 million votes. Donald Trump won by 1.5 percentage points, 2.5 million votes. He won the House of Representatives by a little bit more than Donald Trump, than the Republicans have just won the House of Representatives. A little bit, not much, but he won by a bit more than that. And obviously the Senate was 50-50, so it was a little bit less. But then he interpreted that, what was still ultimately a very narrow election victory, as a mandate. John Meacham told him he was FDR and LBJ squared, and he went off on that approach thinking he was this great world historical president. Again, Trump's won the popular vote by 1.4 percentage points. The House of Representatives is about as close as it could possibly be, a little bit better in the Senate. Is there a danger here that Trump, following the same, I know we all talking this up a little bit, following the same historical analogy, that he's going to interpret this as Nixon in 72 or Reagan in 84?
Sure. The thing about Trump is that he's much more transactional than they were. Maybe transactional in the way that Nixon was. Certainly Reagan was not a transactional politician in this way. And he isn't coming into office with, it seems to be, messianic ambition. I don't know that Biden came into office with messianic ambition, or was just talked into it, or was already starting to go gaga and was easily swayed. But certainly Biden didn't come into office saying, I'm going to spend $6 trillion that I didn't actually tell you that I was planning to spend. There had already been a lot of COVID relief. He's like, we need more COVID relief. And then we need the Green New Deal. And then we need to do this. We need an infrastructure deal. And we need this and we need that. And suddenly the federal government is creating, is leading, is doing monetary policy leading to inflation rising almost to 10%. Not its only reason that this happened, but one of the things that happened. I don't think that Trump's legislative or personal ambitions are that transformative. And so what he has is a question of, are there practical things that he can do to make things better? He has specific policies on the border he wants to pursue. I think that's kind of low-hanging fruit, actually, and that some deportation, not 15 million people deported, but even a couple 100,000 people deported, if that can be done in an orderly and not chaotic fashion, could have a transformative effect on what happens at the border and the pressures at the border coming up from the South. And now this is where we can move on maybe to the Middle East a little bit. Israel has handed him a gigantic like a box with a giant ribbon on it called Destroy Iran's Nuclear Program at Almost No Risk. Iran is without air defenses. Iran is on its back foot. It's lost 2 of its 3 major satellite armies. Hamas is almost dead. Hezbollah is very close to being dead. It is impossible to resupply because of the collapse of Syria. Only the Houthis in Yemen seem to be not unmolested, but acting with more impunity than the others. And Israel is at the ready, with some American help, to nuke the program of the Iranians, the nuclear Iranian program, back to the Stone Age. Not to nuke Iran, right, but to effectively end these ambitions for decades. And I kind of suspect that Trump is going to take them up on it, because you don't get a free shot like this ever. I mean, I can't really think of a time when you had an American adversary weakened in this way that has something that you say you are eager to prevent from happening. As Trump has said from the very beginning of his political career, Iran should not get a nuclear weapon. If it does, we're going to stop them somehow. And there's Israel saying, we have the means, we need your help. We can't do it alone, but we can help you do it. And that transformative thing could be very, 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 very world-changing in a way that will make Americans feel safer, feel better about the projection of American power. It's unilateral to some extent, even though it will involve Israel. So that's something that Republicans like, is not relying on Europeans and others to help do these sorts of things. And I don't know. So we'll see. He's got all kinds of options, and he doesn't have to have some MAGA historian, a version of John Meacham saying, you could be Andrew Jackson, because it's not even necessary.
Let's talk briefly a little bit more about the Middle East. If you think back to where we were a year ago, we were still barely 2 months from the horrors of October 7th. Israel was already under tremendous pressure from the world, but particularly the United States, to kind of rein back its measures against Gaza. Extraordinary as it may seem, it was being already portrayed as the aggressor. Thank God it kind of ignored all of that. And now you have, by the way, my personal nomination for Technology Innovation of the Year is the Grim Beepers of Israel, which I think is going to rank up there historically as one of the all-time great, along with the Trojan
Battle of
Horse.
Agincourt, right? I mean, how many Brits died? Agincourt was like 25 versus
the longbow,
25,000.
25 against 5,000 French or whatever. The longbow. So it's just astonishing. And as you say about Iran, there's an old Scottish saying, never kick a man until he's down. And Iran is down right now, and as we've seen in Syria, you can't get a clearer indication of how down and how weak it is than the fact that the way that Assad's regime crumbled in the space of a week, thanks to the fact that Iran is not able to supply it. Now, with Syria gone, that means the land bridge from Iran to Lebanon and Hezbollah is gone. There is an astonishing opportunity here. Again, it sounds like you think that Trump, in alliance with Bibi, is about to take that. And do you think that means an outright, as you say, destruction, a bombing back to the Stone Age of Iran's nuclear capabilities? Is that now the opportunity that the US should seize?
It's a complete opportunity because it fits in. There's a modest part of Trump's international understanding, right? Which is he doesn't want to do regime change. Right? That's Bush. Bush talked about regime change. That was stupid. We shouldn't be changing regimes. That's not who we are. What we should do is knock the hell out of our enemies and then let them lick their wounds and do whatever it is that they do otherwise. No one is coming here and saying, you know what, if you take out the Iranian nuclear sites and you take out their oil refineries, you broke it. So you better go back and fix it. You better help them rebuild their refineries. You better help them get some nuclear power and that kind of thing. The stuff that was said about the US in Iraq in 2003. This is like, you guys stink. It's been 45 years. You talk us down. You want to kill Jews. You talk about destroying Israel. You're an adversary of America. You say death to America. You took our hostages 45 years ago. We would like to see all of your aggressive effort, everything that you have, in smoldering ruins, and then you go and lick your wounds and rebuild. And whatever your people do to you is fine with us. And whatever you do, we're not helping, we're not hurting, we're not nothing. All we're doing is saying, you're out of the picture as an international destabilizing factor. What was remarkable about what Israel did over the last 3 months is its intention was not to expose Iran's unbelievable, as it turns out, underlying weakness. It did raid Iran. Iran hit Israel, and Israel hit back. It took out Hezbollah, not to take out Iran. It took out Hezbollah to take out Hezbollah. Yeah. And then the Syrian rebels are looking and going, maybe we should just knock on this wall here that Iran has built to protect Assad's regime and see what happens. And the wall just collapses. Because it turns out Iran is not as strong as it appears. It's not as able as it appears. Its air defenses were weaker than they appeared. Its aggressive ability to project power from its own territory was way weaker than it appeared. And Israel was far more able to combat it and its satellites than anybody knew. And so we're sitting with this new knowledge that is new knowledge to us and to the world pretty much over the last 3 months. And it would be the height of foolishness not at least to take some advantage of this new information. that we've been given, particularly if the cost to us is relatively low.
Yeah. You're not only a terrific political analyst and geopolitical commentator, you're also a cultural critic of some repute. I wanted to briefly ask you about the media in 2024 and what we've learned about it here, where it goes from here. Again, forgive me for quoting myself. There's a few things more invidious than self-quoting, but I did write a column a couple of weeks ago where I said, 2016 was the handwriting on the wall for the media. 2024 was the collapse of Babylon. I mean, it just seems to me that traditional media... Look, here's the measure of traditional media's failure. They've spent 10 years, most of them, trying to destroy Donald Trump. That's not even a kind of caricature. That's more or less what they have actually been explicitly trying to do. And 10 years on, he's stronger than he's ever been.
Right.
He got more votes in 2024 than he's ever got. He's got a higher approval rating than he's ever got. He's in a stronger political position than he's ever been. And I can't think of a more palpable example of how the media has failed. Do you think they get it? Does it matter if they get it? Is the game over for these traditional media? What do you see as the lessons of 24 and what on earth they may do afterwards?
So a couple of things have been exposed. I think the major thing that has been exposed is this idea that the political resistance backed by the media promoting the resistance to Trump in its fora, cable news channels, its leading newspapers, and sort of like the panoply of high-end media sources that sort of like set the national conversation. That this ecosystem, a lot of it was supported by illusory things. By which I mean MSNBC and CNN have lost 40 to 50% of their audience since the election, right? They're valuable. They're not dead, but they're valuable not because of their audience. They're valuable because of a very specific thing involving how they get paid by cable systems for carrying the channels, which pay essentially a kind of per subscriber fee to carry these channels. And so they're valuable, but no one's watching them. And for a while, people were watching them.
That game is going to be up sooner or later, right?
And that game is up. 3 years from now, they're paying $2 a head for MSNBC. Someone's going to be paying 25 cents a head for MSNBC because cable is dying and cable is dead, and there's not going to be a cable system that's going to be selling you that stuff. And so some of these outlets, some of these amplification machines are dying. And then what else do we know? We know the New York Times had great financial success by being run quite brilliantly, I have to say, to speak in your stead, following models and policies that had been adopted by the Wall Street Journal 20 years earlier that they could have saved themselves by following in your footsteps or the Journal's footsteps, rather than in this foolishness that they had done of giving everything away for free. Nonetheless, they figured out how to maximize some of their politics, some of their games, some of their recipes, some of their cultural stuff, and make a lot of money. And then you have the Washington Post, totally a rich man's toy, right? It's Jeff Bezos's toy. He bought it. He spent $250 million on it. He's now willing to lose $100 million a year on it. That'll stop. Like, why? What is he getting out of it? So he'll go away. Then you have Mrs. Jobs. She owns a couple of things. Fine. She'll be there. A lot of us, I work in the nonprofit sector. People support me. I'm very grateful to them that they do that and think that commentary is a valuable thing to support. But the world of the mass ecosystem of media being supported by advertising dollars and mass subscribers and all of that is an anachronistic artifact. And it's 2024 now. By 2034, none of it will exist. Things will take its place. But the things that made possible the world of the resistance, which were still kind of there in kind of a degrading form in 2016, are mostly gone now and will be entirely gone over the next decade. And there will be, if people don't want it, they're not going to have it. And that's what they're telling MSNBC and CNN. It's like, you know what? You made us a lot of promises about protecting us from Donald Trump, and you didn't do it. So you know what? The hell with you. We're turning you off. You're boring us and depressing us. And you can yell and scream and talk about how he's a fascist all you like. That really worked brilliantly. Thanks so much. We're going to go take our business elsewhere.
Well, I can't think of a more cheerful note to enter in the full flood of the festive season. And that, thank you very much, John Podhoretz, editor of Commentary Magazine. Thank you as ever.
A pleasure.
Well, that's it for this episode of Free Expression. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today, and indeed this week, and of course throughout 2024. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. Hope you feel a little bit more enlightened, a little bit entertained, a little bit better informed. And if not, please come back and we'll try and do an even better job in 2025. In the meantime, happy holidays, happy Christmas, happy Hanukkah, whatever you're celebrating. I hope it's blessed for you, and a very, very, very happy new year. And I look forward to speaking to you again in 2025. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.